Welcome to another episode of the Upper Bowl Perspective, a Utah Jazz podcast giving you an Upper Bowl point of view with courtside quality. Joined as always by Kyler and Landon. And boys, we have basketball is back. After the last few segments where we've been talking about a lot of non-basketball things like coaching hires and rebrands, we've actually been able to see some more basketball and some Jazz players in uniform playing basketball, which is something that we haven't had now for a few months. So we're excited to talk more about that here in a minute. Just so our listeners know, as always, it's going to be a 2-segment podcast. In the first segment, by request from a few different of our listeners, we're going to be breaking down a little bit more about the Rudy Gobert trade, specifically talking about some of the players that we acquired from Minnesota in that trade. So segment one, we're going to be breaking down the 3 veteran players we got as part of that trade. So that'd be Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, and Jared Vanderbilt. In the second segment, we're going to talk a little bit more about Summer League, some of the top performers for the Jazz so far, along with the other 2 players we got in that trade who we've seen in Summer League or will be playing soon in Summer League, which is Walker Kessler and Leandro Bolmaro, along with a little bit of Jared Butler and Nicholas Caboclo. So that just kind of gives you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. But first things first, let's talk about those 3 players that we can expect to see in a Jazz uniform next year and actually play real minutes for the Jazz. We've each gone through and done a bit of a deep dive into some of the players from that trade. We're going to start with Landon. He's going to be talking a little bit more about Malik Beasley. Kyler will be giving us his take on Pat Bev, and then I'll round it out with Jared Vanderbilt. So Landon, Malik Beasley, he was one of those players in the trade that was arguably the best player or the most important player that we got as part of the trade with the Timberwolves. Just for the listeners who may not be super familiar with who he is as a player, can you just give us an overview, what he is, kind of what his history in the league has looked like, and what potential value he can bring to the Jazz?
Yes, I'd love to. So Malik Beasley, he was drafted by the Denver Nuggets in 2016. Spent 3 seasons there, and then in 2019 was traded to the Minnesota Timberwolves, and that's where he's been for the last few seasons. Really, like when he got traded to Minnesota, his offense took a leap. He's always been a fairly efficient player. He's got a career 43% field goal percentage average, career 38.6% 3-point percent average. But when he got traded to Minnesota, the remainder of that season, he averaged 20 points per game. Following season, he averaged about 19 points per game. Took a step down this year, obviously, with probably the ascension of Anthony Edwards. He only averaged about 12.1 points. But he's definitely a proven scorer in the league. That's probably his MO, is his shooting. And again, just his kind of offensive repertoire. That's definitely the positive. I hope the Jazz keep him. I think he could be a great addition to the team. I think he's someone that can kind of, play off like a Donovan Mitchell pick and roll, kind of help spread the floor, knock down shots. The downside to Malik Beasley is he is not a good defender. This last season, he had defensive rating of 115.8. To put that into perspective, Royce O'Neal last year had a defensive rating of about 103, which would probably be like his most similar comp to someone who played for the Jazz recently. Along with that, Donovan Mitchell had an off defensive rating of 111.4. And we know Donovan Mitchell, at least at this point, is not considered as a stellar defensive player. So Malik Beasley would definitely have to improve his defense, I think, to keep solid rotation minutes. But if he can do that, I think he's got an offense that can make up for some of those flaws.
So I guess here's my question for you, Landon, is with reports we've had over the past couple of days from like Woj and Windhorst, it seems like at least as of right now, Donovan Mitchell is not going to be requesting a trade. At least at this moment, who knows if that's going to change, or who knows if Danny Ainge is going to want to trade him. But as of right now, everything we're hearing both from the talking heads in the media, along with the Jazz organization, is that they want to keep Donovan and build around Donovan. So we're going to go under that assumption, knowing that that could change down the road. Do you think Malik Beasley is somebody who can play effectively with Donovan Mitchell? Because if we're building around Donovan, then we really want to get complementary players for him, which it sounds like guys who can, who are good offensive players, can space the floor, but who aren't great defenders. It seems in that same general overview that you gave him Malik Beasley, it sounds fairly similar to the roles that Jordan Clarkson and Mike Conley have played for the Jazz the past couple of years. Do you think that Malik Beasley is a very similar fit and is a little bit redundant in terms of skill set? Or do you think that there's something else he brings to the table that could help the Jazz that maybe Conley or Clarkson doesn't? Or do you think it makes one of them more expendable?
It's a great question. I think that he offensively anyway complements Donovan Mitchell very well. He can play with the ball. He can play off ball. Again, he's a knockdown 3-point shooter. I think he could help, some of that spacing that would actually help Donovan score. With that said, I do think that he'd probably fill some of the stuff that you saw Royce O'Neal do last year. Again, I think that's probably the most similar comp that we had to Malik Beasley. So I could see him just, spreading the floor, playing off ball, knocking down threes, and then, let Donovan kind of navigate the pick and roll and make those reads, just knowing that he's a 3-point threat. The issue is absolutely defense. He does fit in to those same problems that the Jazz had last year with like Conley and Clarkson on the floor and just kind of the defensive issues that they had there. So I think if we are going to keep him, we would need to supplement the defense that, that backcourt's not going to have by getting ourselves some really good defensive minded wings or another, elite rim protector. If we can do that, I think keep him. If not, then yeah, I think we might want to look at moving him again to get someone who might be a little more defensive minded. But again, I think we have other assets that we could probably move. Malik Beasley's only 25 years old. If we can get off of, a Bojan Bogdanovic contract or a Conley contract, I think he's a better long-term fit with the Jazz and kind of, matches Donovan Mitchell's own kind of career time horizon. So, if we can't keep him, I think we should. I think he, again, fits well. We would just have to figure out a way to bolster our defense.
So, Kyler, I know because we talk a lot of basketball. I've heard you talk a lot about the Utah Jazz backcourt and what that needs to look like going forward. With this Malik Beasley, what do you think the best role is for Donovan? Because we have Malik Beasley, we have Mike Conley, we have Jordan Clarkson. Like those are the most obvious backcourt partners for playing like real minutes with Donovan Mitchell. How many of those players, of those three, do you think the Jazz should have next offseason to really complement the roster that we're trying to build? And who do you think that the Jazz should definitely be putting on the trade market? Because I have a difficult time seeing how all three of those players, Conley, Beasley, and Clarkson, can coexist when our best player right now is a 6'1" score first guard, which I love. Donovan is just none of them seem to be perfect fits, especially on the defensive end of the floor to what the Jazz are trying to do.
Honestly, if I'm Danny Ainge, I think basically Malik Beasley, my ideal role for him is kind of the first guard off the bench, which is what Clarkson is right now. So I would choose one of those two. I personally think Clarkson brings more as a scorer. Like Beasley is a really good shooter, but not a dynamic scorer, whereas Clarkson is. So I would honestly move Mike and Malik and keep Jordan, and then have a more of a 3-and-D backcourt companion to Donovan Mitchell, and then just have Jordan come off the bench and he can play with either of those two guards. So that's me. But if the Jazz think, Jordan's expensive and he's aging and that's not what the Jazz are looking for, and they want to have Malik Beasley as that first guard off the bench instead, that's a really good role for him.
Yeah, that was actually the exact same thought that I had, is that I think that just where the Jazz are now, moving off of a Mike Conley contract makes a lot of sense, and then only keeping one of Jordan or Malik Beasley. I think just right now with where Jordan is, I think a win now team, I think it's easier for them to see the value in a Jordan Clarkson than it is for a Malik Beasley. But I completely agree with you, Kyler, that I think the best role for Malik Beasley is come off the bench, be a little bit of a flamethrower, come and score us 18 points a game and space the floor and knock down threes, rather than being a guy who's playing a lot of minutes with the starting unit, but rather a guy who can go out there and really torch the second unit, which you've seen a lot with Clarkson this last little bit. Either way, Clarkson, Malik Beasley, Mike Conley, all those are very valuable players in the league. And I'm sure that any of them would have interest from other teams. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Jazz do with their roster construction to make sure that everything they're saying about building for the future, building around Donovan, how are they actually going to make that work? And is it going to be this season? Or are we going to see more of like a Golden State from 3 years ago lineup where they're throwing out 3 guards? Either way, it's going to be very interesting to see what the Jazz do between now and opening day. However, in that Timberwolves trade, not only did they get Malik Beasley, who's a great offensive guard, but is not very good on defense, they also got a defensive specialist guard who may not be the best person on offense, which is Patrick Beverley. Kyler, I know that you were excited to give this take, so I'm not going to preface it too much. Let's just give you the floor for a couple minutes and give us your Pat Bev lowdown.
Well, to keep things family friendly, not Malik Beasley. Patrick Beverley is a piece of crap human being that plays basketball. His sole purpose is to get under the opposing team's skin. And you always hear those sayings like, oh, he's one of those guys that when he plays for the team, you hate him, but when he's on your team, you love him. I think that's not accurate. Just like I respect people who play basketball and are respectful to other people, and that's just not Pat Beverley. Like, if you look at his numbers, nothing's really gonna be like, wow, he's really good. And so he's just kind of been billed as like almost this like, oh, he's a good culture guy because he plays with a lot of intensity. And I almost view someone like that as someone kind of like Jay Crowder. When everyone knows that I was a really big Jay Crowder fan when he was with the Jazz, because he brought a lot of energy, but he didn't do it in a toxic way like Patrick Beverley does. And so if you just look at all of his skill sets, shooting, average at best, driving, not something that you're going to put on the scouting report, is his ability to drive, passing, again, just unremarkable. And defensively, he's 6'1", so he's very limited there. I think he's more of a pesky defender than he is even a good defender. I almost feel like his defensive skill set is overrated, but he's really, really good at making the opponent angry. And again, family friendly, being a piece of crap human being. So I don't want him on the team. Out of all the players, I hope he's the one that gets rerouted the most. A, because I don't want another 6'1" guard on the team. That's just ridiculous. And B, I do not want to root for Patrick Beverley. I don't know if you want to go into stats. Basically, throughout his career, he's been anywhere from kind of like the least important starter to kind of like the 7th, 8th man. That's kind of been in the range. Rotation guy, but not a guy that, is a super important part of the team. And kind of like if you have a ball dominant guy that's not your point guard, then he's like the perfect guard to put next to him because he doesn't need the ball on offense. And so unfortunately, the Jazz ball dominant guy hopefully is playing the point guard position. So I think he's not a great fit next to Donovan either, even though he is a good defender. So.
All right, let's break this down a little bit. I don't think we need to go too much into Patrick Beverley's reputation in the league. I think if you asked a lot of NBA players or a lot of NBA fans, like their top 5 most hated players in the league, I think Patrick Beverley would make a lot of those lists. And I think he's also one of the leaders the last few years when it just comes to technical fouls, because he is one of those guys who, while he does bring a huge level of intensity and a level of accountability to all the teams that he plays for, the way that he does it is definitely not just intent. It's borderline abrasive, which is why a lot of people aren't huge Pat Bev fans. But looking at it purely from a basketball perspective, do you think that Pat Bev could be valuable to the Jazz if they can't find a valuable trade package for him, where he could potentially be someone who could come off the bench, be like that 4th guard in our lineup, where his job is just to come in and make another lead scoring guard's life difficult for 12, 15 minutes a game? Do you think that would still be valuable just from a purely basketball perspective, even if we don't love Patrick Beverley on the Jazz?
Well, I don't think he's happy in that role. Throughout his career, I don't think he's been less than a 20-minute per game guy since like the very beginning. So he wants more of like a 25-minute per game role. And Like if he was the guy that you're just playing 10 minutes a game to full court press and just bug the other guard, like a couple 5-minute stints each half, maybe, but I don't think he's happy with that role. He's gonna want to go somewhere and like affect winning. I also question they're like, oh, he's gonna affect winning. Like, what has he won? Like he won the play-in game with the Timberwolves, and that reaction is kind of got famous. Is it looked like they won the freaking finals because that was the most important game of his career, and so I think he's vastly overrated and also kind of a punk. So I just don't the role that I think he's best for, I think he wouldn't be happy with. He'd wanted an expanded role.
I think we would all prefer to get Patrick Beverley not in Utah, because if you look at his role in Minnesota, his role made a lot of sense, right? Because their lead guard, Anthony Edwards, is 6'6" and built like a tank, right? So it's like having Patrick Beverley coming in with their guard rotation made a lot of sense because a lot of their starting guards were really big, really athletic. So he played a really complementary role, where because his size is that he might even be shorter than Donovan, which Donovan is not a tall dude in the NBA. It doesn't seem near as complimentary. So I think we would all prefer, both from a basketball perspective, a complimentary perspective to Donovan, and just purely from a culture perspective, we'd all rather see Patrick Beverley out and get him traded ideally before the season starts. What do you think Patrick Beverley is worth in the market? Like, do you think teams would even be calling the Jazz saying, hey, we'd love to get Patrick Beverley? Or do you think he's someone that we're going to have to trade for like a top 55 protected second, like 4 years from now?
Nah, just top 45, top 45. I honestly think somebody will just like take him into their trade exception for like a next to nothing asset. And I think honestly the Jazz, I don't know if the Jazz would take it because Danny Ainge is quite a stingy man, but I think they should.
Yeah. I kind of disagree that the Jazz don't need a Patrick Beverley. I mean, think back to last year in the playoffs. Like the Dallas Mavericks made an absolute mockery of our perimeter defense. I feel like having a dude like Patrick Beverley, who takes a lot of pride on that in the floor, wouldn't have allowed something like that to happen. Like if he would have stuck Patrick Beverley on Jalen Brunson, he wouldn't have torched the Jazz in that first round. So I think having a guy who brings that type of intensity and someone who's going to be able to hold, like, especially our perimeter guys accountable on defense is something that I think could be incredibly valuable. I mean, who knows what the Jazz are going to do with their roster? Maybe he doesn't fit, but like as constructed right now, I think having a guy like Patrick Beverley would be incredibly valuable to the Jazz. I mean, I don't know how much he's going to play. You certainly wouldn't start him. I think he'd come off the bench. I don't think you'd want to play him with Donovan too much. I think that's a bad combination, but if you need someone who's going to go get under, like, a guard skin because he just dropped 30 on whoever the Jazz had on in the first half, he's a perfect guy for that. And again, someone who I think can really hopefully whip some of our other guys into shape on the defensive end and get them to play, more defense, match his energy. I agree that I don't think he has a ton of value, which I think is more the reason why the Jazz should keep him, because I think he could probably give us more value playing on our team than whatever we're going to get, like some second round pick that we might get for him. I know he's a punk. I know he's obnoxious, but I think like for the Jazz specifically from a culture perspective, we need a guy like that to kind of, kick us in our pants and get us to play a little harder, with a little more urgency.
Yeah, I think that's true. I just don't think that Patrick Beverley is a good source of it. Like we were really soft. There's kind of the reports that even like in the regular season, like if you push the Jazz in the fourth quarter, like we gave up a ton of leads because as soon as the going got rough for the Jazz folded often last year. And so we do need that intensity. I just think Patrick Beverley is a toxic kind of intensity where I would want somebody who brings a more healthy kind of competitiveness and fire to the team.
Well, it'll be definitely interesting because my big question right now for the Jazz that I'm excited to see going in to the actual regular season over the next couple of months is what is our backcourt lineups going to look like? What are those rotations going to look like? It's certainly going to be interesting because we don't have a lot of wings right now. We have some, but we have a lot of guards. So it'll definitely be interesting to see what the Jazz do between now and October in terms of building out that roster. The last player we're going to talk about is the third veteran guy we got through the trade, which is Jared Vanderbilt. If you're not a huge NBA fan, but you're more of a Jazz fan, this is probably a guy you don't know a lot about, but he's been low-key one of my favorite non-Jazz players for the last couple of years, not because he's super amazing, but because I love him in his role. As Kyler and Landon know, there's a couple types of players that I just really fixate on. One of them is those stretch bigs from Europe. I don't know why, but I always seem to fall in love with them in the draft. And the second type of player that I love is a player that impacts winning on a high level without needing the ball a lot to score. And that's the type of player that I think Jared Vanderbilt is. He's only 20. I think he was born in 99. So I think he's only like 22 right now. But he came out of Kentucky. He was drafted in the second round. He's a 6'9" kind of power forward center hybrid. He plays actually a lot of small ball center, which is what he's been doing for the Timberwolves the past couple of years. He's a really good defender. He's an exceptional rebounder for his size. In 25 minutes playing a game for the Wolves last year, he was averaging almost 9 rebounds a game. So if you look at his per 36 minutes, he's over 10 rebounds a game, which is really impressive for a 6'9" guy. And he's a really, really versatile defender, just the type of guy that you really want on your team because he can guard other wings. He can even guard in the paint a little bit just because that's the type of player that he is. And while he is a defensive specialist, really where he struggled his entire career is on the offensive end of the court. He's not a shooter at all. He's 15% career from three-point range on very low attempts per game, so he doesn't shoot the ball often at all. And he's only like 60% from the free throw line, so there's not a lot of hope that he's going to become a shooter down the road. However, when he does actually shoot, it's not unlike Rudy in the sense that he's always within just a couple feet of the basket, and he's usually wide open because of how the play's been set up. So he shoots almost 60% from the field, even though all of his shots are within like 5 feet. I love Jared Vanderbilt as a signing because one of the things I think the Jazz have needed a lot the past couple of years is more flexibility on the defensive end of the court. We've always had very just big traditional centers, and having a small ball 5 option I think is really important so that especially in the postseason, if the Jazz are able to make it there, they have more lineup flexibility in terms of what they can do to play against other lineups with some of the best teams in the West. So for Jared Vanderbilt, he's the type of guy that he can start for you as a power forward. He can come off the bench. He can play those small ball 5 minutes, but he's definitely shown to be somebody who, because of his defensive ability and his smart playing, is someone who's definitely valuable to a franchise. And I'm excited that even though I don't think he's going to have the same 26 minutes a game role on the Jazz maybe that he had last year with the Timberwolves, I think he's somebody that's going to be very valuable to lineup constructions and making sure that the Jazz are a little bit stronger defensively.
Yeah, absolutely. Out of all the guys, at least the veterans, although I actually probably would include the 2 prospects we got, he's the guy that I'm hoping sticks with the Jazz the most, just because he can, add a lot of flexibility like you were already stating. He played a lot in the dunker spot in Minnesota, which is he's not really going to be able to do much more than that. Like you were saying, his percentages anywhere outside of the basically restricted area are bad. But just to compare, I'm not saying he is this player, but you look at Will Hardy and what he had in Robert Williams. I can imagine a very similar role. He's not nearly the athlete. He's not going to be out there blocking 3-pointers all the time like Robert Williams was, but just somebody that can kind of play a roaming spot on defense where he can play a lot of help. Like secondary rim protection. I've been like, I've had a lot of conversations about how the Jazz needs somebody else on the court that can at least sort of protect the rim, and that's what Jared Vanderbilt can provide as well. And so, super good bench player. Can play. He can be in like your 8-man rotation in the playoffs for sure.
Oh, for sure. He's one of those type of guys that when you start cutting down your roster, he's one that you're like, we're definitely going to be playing him more, not less in the playoffs, just because of the type of skill set that he brings to the court and honestly just how he affects winning. He was a guy who averaged almost 9 rebounds a game and like 6.5 points last year. So even though he's not going to score a lot of points, he is out there because he is a really solid defender and he makes a lot of smart plays. it was actually interesting as I was doing my deep dive on Jared Vanderbilt. I was looking at 538, and they have this really cool feature where you can take a player and they will compare their just like the history of them in the league, and they'll give you a list of other players and seasons saying, based on where they're at right now in the career, they are most similar to these players from history, and they'll give you a list of 10. And it was actually super interesting to look at that list because in the top 10 players of all time, it had 2017 Clint Capella, like 2015 Kenneth Faried, and 2020 Bam Adebayo was 3 of the 10 most similar players that like Jared Vanderbilt's career progression has been based off of. And actually number 3 on that list was Kevon Looney from 2021. So it's really interesting to see that we see all these big men who are really versatile, who've played a lot of really solid minutes in the past for their teams in the playoffs, playing kind of that smaller, big role, have been able to be incredibly beneficial. So even though Jared Vanderbilt maybe isn't the flashiest player or the biggest name player that we got in this draft, I think that he has the chance to be the most impactful.
Yeah, I definitely think of all the players we got, he's probably the one most likely to stay. His value is definitely there. I'm glad we got him. I think he brings a lot of value that we need. But I'm trying to understand what his role would be. I mean, we do have kind of a hole at center right now that we need to fill. Do you think that he could be like a starting center? You think he'd be a backup center? I could also see him maybe coming in and just kind of filling in where the Jazz need off the bench. Maybe like there's a particular matchup that we're not doing well on. You can throw him and whoever that guy is and have him, just be that kind of lockdown defender. But I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think just because of his size, I mean, he's not super, super thick. Like he's 6'9", 214 is the size that they have him listed on at ESPN. So I think in a lot of matchups, you can't start him as center because like bigger traditional centers, I think are like, even though he's a really good defender, it's going to be a lot harder for him to play that role. He started 67 games last season next to Cat in the front court as a power forward. I think he's the type of guy that, although his most ideal role might be coming off the bench, I think he's a guy that if he's going to start, it has to be in that power forward position, except for very specific lineups. Just because even though he's a really good defender, he doesn't have that same physical presence that somebody like a Nikola Jokic or maybe an Anthony Davis, I think would be able to take advantage of that a little bit if they're going to be guarded by him for extended minutes. And then in that same kind of vein, he's not much of a scorer. So I think starting him in a center position would be maybe a little bit difficult, where we would want a little bit more action on the paint from our starting center. So I think he's somebody that if we need him to start in that power forward position, he definitely could fill that role and fill it pretty well if needed. But I think his most ideal role is to be like the 7th guy on the roster who still plays a lot of minutes, but plays it more against second units and in that small ball center role.
Yeah, I mean, if he's a starter, it's for a 2 big team. He's not like going to be the only big on the court. Kind of like how you saw, once again, going back to Boston, the 2 bigs of Robert Williams and Al Horford, or in Milwaukee, they had Giannis and Lopez starting, just like, and one of them always can shoot, or Minnesota, him and Cat. So if the Jazz have a true center that can shoot threes, I think he can start. If not, he's more of like your 7th or 8th guy.
Well, those are 3 new players. Listeners, we hope you enjoyed that overview of those 3 veterans we got, because if those 3, if they end up being on the Jazz when it starts that they're not traded between now and October, we're definitely going to be seeing them play real minutes because those are the type of players they are in this league. So hopefully you enjoyed that segment and getting to learn a little bit more about Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, and Jared Vanderbilt. We're going to be back in just a minute with part 2, where we're going to be diving a little bit more into Summer League. We have some fun stuff to talk about. Jared Butler has been one of the stars of the Summer League. We also got Caboclo. We can talk a little bit more about Walker Kessler and Leandro Bolmaro that we got from the Timberwolves trade. But we got a lot of fun stuff coming to you for guys who are probably going to be on the roster next year and could potentially be some guys that we see in a Jazz uniform. So we're going to take a break and we'll be back in just a minute with part 2. Welcome to part 2 of this edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective. In part 1, we talked a little bit more about some of the trade pieces the Jazz got from the Rudy Gobert trade, specifically Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, and Jared Vanderbilt. In this segment, we're going to be talking more about the Jazz's performance in Summer League so far through their first 3 games, and also breaking down a little bit more about some of the younger players that the Jazz got from that Timberwolves trade. First off, the Jazz during Summer League, Summer League in terms of how that impacts the regular season, how that affects winning, what that says about our team is pretty much non-existent. The purpose of the Summer League is for young guys to get experience, for the Jazz to experiment with some players they might want to sign on their roster. And nobody that's playing in Summer League is probably going to average huge minutes for the Jazz this upcoming season, with the exception of a couple of our very recent draft picks. That being said, the Jazz have so far gone 0-3 in Summer League. They have yet to win a game. But instead of focusing on the fact that we haven't won, we really want to focus more of the segment about what we have learned from Summer League in terms of how this could actually affect the regular season for the Jazz, which is what Summer League's about. We're going to go through and break down a few different players that have really shined in Summer League who could potentially make the Jazz roster or get a two-way contract, then also talk a little bit more about some of those Timberwolves players. So far, the star of Summer League for the Jazz has been Jared Butler. For those of you who don't remember, the Jazz drafted him a year ago in the second round with the 40th overall pick. He was a standout player in college, extremely, extremely good. He fell in the draft due to some medical issues. Apparently, when teams saw his medicals, that's what caused him to draft. Because if he wouldn't have had some of those issues going into the draft, he was projected to be a lottery pick in a lot of different mock drafts. And he was even arguably at the time considered the steal of the draft. He played very little for the Jazz this past season, and he's been developing into somebody that the Jazz might be able to bring into as a rotational guard. The big highlight for him was the third game the Jazz played against the Grizzlies. He ended up with 22 points, 7 rebounds, and 7 assists, which that's a really impressive stat line for anybody, but especially for someone as young as Butler, it really gave some promise that he might be a guy who could actually be a rotation player for the Jazz. Kyler, after seeing his performance, looking at how he's done in Summer League, what do you think the chances are that he actually plays for an average of more than 10 minutes for the Jazz next season?
My hope for it is a lot greater than what I think the realism is. We just have so many guards on the roster right now, and so we would have to turn so many of them into wings for him to get up to like the 4th guard on the team. We highlighted just in the previous segment how we're like super heavy in the guards right now. So I think we'd have to basically do a complete 180 for him to play. But he has been impressive. He had a pretty bad game 1. He was kind of rusty, which, you can't exactly blame. It's the first, it might be like the first organized basketball he's played in a while. But he definitely, every game, got more comfortable. And he wasn't great shooting, but just based on those numbers, you saw 7 rebounds, 7 assists. He was directing the offense really well, and he was playing good defense, and he was impacting the game just outside of his scoring. So I think he's a player that could be good for the Jazz as a bench guard. I just don't know if we're going to make enough trades for him to end up being just kind of like the 4th best guard on our team.
Yeah, which I think, Kyler, you bring up a really good point here, because if you look at the Jazz's guard rotation right now, who are all the guards who are currently better than him? You have obviously Donovan, you have Mike Conley, you have Jordan Clarkson, you have Malik Beasley. Right now, is he the 5th guard, or do we even have a Trent Forrest ahead of him?
Patrick Beverley right now is there too. I don't think Trent Forrest would be ahead of him because a lot of the reporting was Trent Forrest was like a Quinn Snyder guy. And so Quinn Snyder's not here. So I would think that the young head coach might go for the younger player with more potential. I would hope. So that puts him at 6th or 7th, depending on what you feel of Trent Forrest.
Yeah. And 6 or 7 guard, the 6th or 7th guard on a roster, the amount of minutes that he's playing is what? 5 minutes garbage time when you're down by 30. he is not going to be getting real rotational minutes. But if we could get him to the point where, let's say, we trade a Mike Conley, we trade a Patrick Beverley, etc., if we could even get him into that fourth guard spot where he could be playing 7-8 minutes a game, that could be invaluable for his progression, and see if could he be a guy who could be eventually a starting caliber guy, like as a fifth best starter, or could he be somebody who's like your first guard off the bench? Because when you're drafting out of the second round, I think that's about the best you can hope for, is just a solid rotation player who's not terrible. And I think Jared Butler could definitely be that, but he hasn't really had the opportunity on an NBA floor to get that. But he's definitely shown enough flashes, especially with that last game in Summer League, that he might be a guard who can do a little bit of everything. He can pass a little bit, he can shoot a little bit, he can score, he can grab those rebounds. So the hope is that the Jazz found one of those diamonds in the rough in the second round, and he will be able to play. Landon, let's just say that Jared Butler does get into a position where he's playing, I don't know, 2 5-minute stints a half. He's playing 10 minutes a game. What do you think those minutes will look like defensively or offensively for the Jazz guards during those 10 minutes a game?
When Jared Butler is on the floor, I think I like him more as like a facilitator on the offensive end than I do as like a scorer. So that's what I see his primary role would be, probably playing with, maybe guys like Clarkson or Beasley or whoever's on the court right there, and just kind of setting them up. That's not to say that he couldn't develop into a scorer. I think that, he's got an NBA ready handle, NBA ready, quick step, great jump shot. But I think those things to like really get like work in the NBA, it's just going to take some time for him. But I think what he can do right now at an NBA level is kind of read an offense and make passes, I think. So that's what I see his role offensively. I mean, defensively, that's kind of the big question about, I think, the biggest thing to determine like how many minutes he gets or what type of role he has is going to be his defense. Clearly, that's something that we are lacking. If he can provide that defense that we haven't been lacking, that's what's going to earn him minutes, I really think. So what I hope to see then is just him really recognizing that and just bringing that type of energy, that effort on that level, because I think he's got the athleticism and the size if he's guarding guards to match up with anybody. He's 6'3", close to 200 pounds. So I mean, physically that's probably pretty close to what the average for a point guard would be. You should be able to kind of match up with them. So that's what I hope to see. Maybe almost like Patrick Beverley-esque on the defensive end, just being that dog, just really getting into their guards, really causing problems for them. Because really, I think, again, that's probably the only way he's going to get any real minutes is if he can kind of show that defensive intensity.
Yeah. Which, I mean, that's more or less why Trent Forrest got so many minutes last year, is because even though he wasn't much of a scorer, he definitely tried extremely hard on defense, which was why that was probably the main reason that Quinn Snyder loved him so much. It's actually really interesting that you bring up that defensive side of things, because I think a lot of Jazz fans that I talk to, when they talk about Jared Butler, they talk about his scoring ability and they talk about his passing ability. But I completely agree that if he's going to get real minutes on the roster, he's got to be the type of guy who is a dog on defense, who plays really hard and can be a positive on the defensive end of the court. After he had that outing against the Grizzlies with the 22-7-7, I don't remember which Jazz coach it was. It was one of the assistants, but he was doing an interview and he talked about Jared Butler. And he said, like, yeah, he had a good game, but we're really working with him on making him a defensive-minded guard and somebody who comes in, and that's where he makes the real minutes, where he's not so focused on scoring and making maybe some of those flashy passes, but he's somebody that's focused on making the other guard's life hell for 10 minutes, a game. And if Jared Butler can turn into that, like, those type of defensive players are extremely, extremely valuable in the league. And we already know that he can play some offense because he was able to show that even in some very limited time last year, that he is a guy who can score. Kyler, with Patrick Beverley, we already talked about Patrick Beverley, but do you think about him? Well, but I mean, do you think that for the reason of developing Jared Butler into that defensive-minded guard, do you think potentially that could be a reason why Patrick Beverley might be valuable to the Jazz?
I don't want him to turn into Patrick Beverley. No,
well,
I want him to turn into a respectable NBA player that's good and kind to people, but also kicks their trash on the basketball court. Not opposite.
What if Patrick Beverley could bring in that aspect? Not the I get technicals and I complain and everything else type of Patrick Beverley, but what if he's just able to be a mentor to Jared Butler, just on the here's how you play exceptional on-ball defense on another guard. What if he can just bring that? Like, would that be valuable from that perspective?
Sure, it'd be valuable, but Patrick Beverley doesn't want to do that. He believes he's yet to play a season under 20 minutes per game. So that's not the role he believes he's fit for. He's going to be he's going to be a malcontent player if that's the Jazz just say, hey, you're not playing. We only want you to mentor Jared Butler. So again, I just don't think it's a fit even in that role.
Well, I mean, maybe in future segments I can see if I can find reasons why we might be happy that Patrick Beverley's on the Jazz. I know we've tried a few times. I don't know if it's possible, if it's ever going to happen. Just to be clear, I'm not happy that Patrick Beverley is on the Jazz because I don't love him as a player either. But I do believe in trying to find silver linings, and maybe eventually we'll be able to find one. But based on the current reactions, it's going to be tough for Upper Bowl perspective to come to that conclusion.
I'm going to laugh when Beverly and Butler start by the end of the next season.
That's our starting duo. I mean, at least like Landon and I, between these segments, we're talking about how like there's no prospects that are exciting for the Jazz to watch. At least if Jared Butler is starting, you're excited to watch him progress, right? So I honestly wouldn't hate it.
Yeah. And I mean, like, maybe at that point, like, if we have Patrick Beverley and Jared Butler starting, we may need to change our name to the lower bowl perspective because we might actually be able to afford lower bowl tickets if that's our starting backcourt. But maybe for that reason,
Wembanyama coming in next season if that's our starting backcourt.
Do not even get me started on Victor Wembanyama because that man is beautiful to watch play basketball. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the Wembanyama sweepstakes. The other major standout for the Jazz, which is a very different story than a Jared Butler, who was just drafted last year, is Bruno Caboclo, who's been playing for the Jazz. He was actually drafted 20th overall back in 2014. So he was drafted over 8 years ago. He's got like the perfect type of NBA body that you'd want. He's 6'9", 218, kind of plays that forward wing position. But even coming out of the draft, there was a reporter who described Bruno Caboclo as being a guy who was 2 years away from being 2 years away. So he was definitely touted as one of those guys who he kind of has all the right pieces, hasn't put it together yet, but he might be somebody who could be super valuable in the future. We're now 8 years from the point that he's being drafted, and this is arguably the best press that Bruno Caboclo has gotten since being drafted in 2014 is the fact that he's been playing really well on the Jazz's summer league team. He's been averaging close to 17 points a game. He's been rebounding the ball well and just playing really, really solid defense overall. He definitely is a more mature player, not the type that you see in summer league as often as you do younger guys. Do you think there's any chance that with the Jazz, who are absolutely desperate to get some more wings on their roster, especially ones who have the size of Caboclo, do you think there's any chance that he actually gets a contract with the Jazz, whether it be just a 1 year deal, 2 year deal, or even a 2-way contract? Or do you think that that's being wildly optimistic for a guy who was drafted 8 years ago and hasn't shown that he can be somebody who can contribute to an NBA team?
Well, I think you kind of said it. I think they might sign him out of necessity. If they can't get another deal done for like, NBA level wing, they might need him. So I could see them signing him that way. And I could see him maybe bring some value on the defensive end again, just kind of provide that versatility. Got great at, you said, perfect NBA body for defense. As far as him being anything other than a role player, maybe like your eighth guy off the bench, I don't see it. I mean, there's a reason he's gone as long as he has after draft without really cracking rotations.
Yeah, I almost see it like if it's going to work out, it's going to be like, ninth man, like not even because like you have a really solid starting 8 and then you have like kind of a ninth guy that comes in and plays a few minutes. He might make that if the Jazz don't swap out a ton of guards for a ton of wings. And so he's done a little bit of everything for the Jazz in this summer league. He kind of looks like he might be ready. And so if I'm the Jazz, where I don't got a lot going for me right now in the roster, I would offer him just a 1 year deal. I wouldn't have a problem with him taking up one of our NBA roster spots at all.
And I feel like it's very contingent on what the Jazz are able to do in the next couple weeks here. As far as what other moves they can make, that'll depend on if he's going to get a roster spot or not. I really think that.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're unfrozen.
Yeah.
Okay.
We stalled until you came back.
It's all right. All right. I have no idea what I missed. The last thing we were talking about was Bruno Caboclo. I hope that I didn't interrupt anything. But the question I had is that, Kyler, the last thing I heard from you is that you were saying maybe he can be like the ninth guy on the roster, plays a little bit. I think the Jazz are required to have, is it 12 guys signed to the roster
It's
by
14
starting
these
day?
days.
It's how many?
14.
14. So I think for a guy who has that age, who's probably been humbled a little bit to play whatever role comes his way, I have a hard time seeing where the Jazz don't at least offer him one of those 14 roster spots, even if he's a guy who never sees minutes or especially meaningful minutes. I think he's enough for the Jazz to take a flyer on, even though I don't think any of us expect him to be a guy who plays more than a few minutes average per game.
Yeah, I mean, barring injury, the Jazz aren't going to ask him to be like our top wing off the bench. Like that's fairly unrealistic. But taking a roster spot, I would almost say that if we were betting men, that would be the favorite at this point, is that he would actually make the roster this year.
Yeah, which that would certainly be a win for him after, I mean, being drafted 20th overall and then having the type of NBA career that he's had, where now he's probably 27 playing in summer league. I mean, like that's got to be a difficult spot for him because his trajectory has been much different than I think he would have hoped. But I think he's a guy who could come in and contribute as a deep bench player, and it would be exciting to see if summer league actually ends up yielding that for us.
He could be like a Gary Payton type player for the Warriors.
One can
grind
hope.
his way into a roster spot.
If you're a really big Caboclo fan, that's what you're hoping for.
I mean, like, that's actually a really good comp on maybe the best case scenario because Gary Payton, he struggled to get onto an NBA roster and to get meaningful minutes. And now he was a huge reason because of his defensive ability why the Golden State Warriors were able to win the finals. So Gary Payton, Bruno Caboclo, who knows, maybe we'll be able to see a player like that 2 years in a row because that would certainly be amazing if he could turn into that kind of an impact player. The other major player that we've seen so far playing with the Jazz that has been, I guess, maybe better than average has been Kofi Cockburn, or as we talked about in past podcast, is Kofi Cockburn, which, Kyler, we already know that that's his preferred pronunciation of the player. Not too much to go on here, but he's another traditional center. Dude's huge, 7 feet tall, close to 300 pounds, and just an absolute beast in the paint, even though he's not, well, he doesn't have an elite skill set anywhere. With the Jazz already having Udoka Azubuike and Walker Kessler, who was just drafted by the Timberwolves and then traded to the Jazz in that Rudy Gobert trade, do you think there's any chance that he actually makes the roster as another center, or do you think he's just another guy that we have specifically for Summer League?
Maybe two-way, maybe. I don't think he ends up getting more than that, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got potential just because of his size. And I think comparing him to someone like Taco Fall, I think he's, a little more agile than that, a little more mobile. He's probably going to have to spend a hot minute in the G League, though, before he really becomes NBA caliber player. But I could see them throwing him, two-way contract.
Yeah. I think that Exhibit 10 contract is still probably the most likely for Kofi, just because of where he's at in the developmental process. Because if he's going to be like an NBA guy who's getting minutes, he's got to be a little bit faster. He's got to be a little bit more versatile on defense. And it's just not possible to be fast and versatile when you're 300 pounds. But I think if he's a guy who could work on his body, who can maybe do really, really well in like the G League, get better there, get some of that conditioning down, then who knows? Maybe he'll be a guy who could come in as a two-way in the future. But as of right now, I think compared to the performance of Udoka Azubuike and the promise of Walker Kessler, I think he's definitely a guy that is not going to see minutes for the Jazz this season, unless something major happens. All right. Are there any other guys that you guys want to talk about from the Summer League? I mean, I've watched some highlights, I've read some stuff, and there's really nobody that I have a desire to talk about just because their likelihood of getting a two-way contract just seems astronomical at this point. But is there anyone else that stood out to you that you think could possibly be a contributor for the Jazz this season?
No, not really. I mean, I forget. Not Coburn, not Juzang. What's that third UDFA that the Jazz signed? I can't think of his name right now.
Oh, Jordan Usher.
Yeah, he showed flashes, but not to the extent that I think he's getting a two-way. But he showed as that kind of high energy guy. I think he at least deserves a shout out, if not like a deep dive.
I don't think the timing's great. I think that he's probably going to work his way into an NBA roster at some point, but probably not with the Jazz.
Yeah, I mean, athletic, high energy. He could do it. So, but I think that's it. Like you said earlier, just like our summer league roster is so barren in terms of like actual NBA talent. And it's something that in earlier podcasts I alluded to. Like we do not have good prospects. I watched the Jazz OKC game and just like watched how half of the roster that's going to play for them next year was on their summer league team, and it just made me super jealous.
Yeah. Which, I mean, we'll see what happens. We've talked about Jared Butler, who's arguably our best developmental prospect right now. And we are still waiting to see how Johnny Juzang looks when he plays in Summer League. His start has been pushed back a little bit because he was in a car accident is what I read. But there is talk that he's going to play in the Jazz's next Summer League game. So depending on how he performs, we may be bringing him up in a future podcast. But as of right now, I still think out of all the guys we signed post-draft, he's the one who has the most potential to be a guy who plays for the Jazz just because of his offensive ability. But because he hasn't really played, there's not too much to talk about here, but we'll be sure to update our listeners when we have some more info there. Now for the two guys who are really young that we got from that Timberwolves trade. And the one that we should be most excited out of the two is definitely Walker Kessler. Just for our listeners who aren't big draft junkies like we are, Walker Kessler was drafted by the Timberwolves in the first round with the 22nd overall pick. He was the third center taken in the draft after Jalen Duren and Mark Williams. And he played for Auburn this last season along with top 3 pick Jabari Smith. He's a very traditional center. He's 7 foot. He doesn't stretch the floor. He only shoots like 58% from the free throw line last year, but he's definitely a defensive-minded center. In addition to 11 points and 9 rebounds last year, he also averaged 4.5 blocks per game, which is a pretty insane number. He's out of all the people coming into the draft this year, he was probably touted as the most elite rim protector of the group, even though Jalen Duren and Mark Williams were better center prospects than he was. It's very, very interesting as the Jazz, who've drafted more traditional centers like Udoka Azubuike with their first overall picks in the past. I don't know if I just have Jazz first round center drafting PTSD because of Udoka Azubuike, but do we think that Walker Kessler could be a guy who could play real minutes for the Jazz? He hasn't played in Summer League yet. I think the deal was actually just finalized this morning. We're recording this on Saturday where he was officially traded to the Jazz. And now he's officially a member of the team. But do you think he's somebody who could potentially be our new backup center or even potentially start later down the road?
I mean, if you like a guy that rebounds and blocks shots, you like Walker Kessler. If you want your center to do anything else, then you will not like you thought you were frustrated by Gobert's lack of ability to create anything on his own on offense. Oh boy, I'll just say that. And just one update, because you were talking about how he just got signed. He will not be playing in Summer League because of a pre-draft foot injury. So we won't get to see him. But I think you kind of already know what to expect with him. It's the same kind of center that the Jazz always get. I'm a little bit frustrated that they don't like more dynamic centers, but in terms of being that rim running, shot blocking center, very good at least the shot blocking part.
Yeah, I'd definitely be more confident of him getting a roster spot if Quinn Snyder was still around. I have no idea what Will Hardy's vision of this team is going to be and what type of role he fits. I mean, this type of player is kind of going extinct in the NBA. You don't see these traditional centers anymore. So it's tough to say. He might get some minutes just out of, roster needs. Again, I don't know who's on our depth chart right now for center. We got Azubuike and Walker Kessler. Do we have any other real centers under contract?
Jared Vanderbilt's a big, but he's not a traditional center.
Yeah, so play that way. But yeah, I don't know how many minutes to get. I'm definitely be wary of him being here long term, or at least being in the rotation long term for extended minutes. I don't see us going that direction again.
Yeah. I think what's difficult is that we have Udoka Azubuike, we have Walker Kessler, and we definitely don't need both. Neither of them, as of right now, are starting caliber centers in the league. And with Walker Kessler, I mean, he's a rookie, so there's always hope with rookies that they can be better than they project, or maybe that they can improve. With Doak, I'm not as confident just because he's now been in the league for a couple of years. We've seen his limitations both on the offensive and defensive ends of the court. So I don't think that having both of them on the roster makes a ton of sense, especially if you're not expecting to play both of them. The one thing I do like about Walker Kessler is that because he is a great defensive player and he can rebound and he can block shots, he's somebody who could always be like a good backup center, which I think is probably his role in the NBA as we move away from traditional centers. But if you're playing in a series against one of those elite centers in the league, like a Nikola Jokic, like an Anthony Davis, like a Joel Embiid, he is the type of guy that can go in and I mean, he can play hard in the paint. He can make some good defensive plays. He's good for 6 fouls a game, but I don't see him as being somebody who projects to be a starting caliber center in the league who's going to actually make a difference to a winning team. But could he be valuable in a backup role? And do we have him under contract now for the next 4 years? We do. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the Jazz actually use him in minutes, if they're going to play him real minutes, if it's just going to be garbage time, if they're going to have him spend a lot of time in the G League. I don't know exactly how it's going to look for Walker Kessler, but I think because he does have 2 elite skill sets coming out of the draft with the rim protection and the rebounding, then there's at least hope that he could be a solid player for the Jazz down the road, even if just based on his limitations, both offensively and defensively, he doesn't project to be a starting caliber player down the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's always hope for a guy. I mean, like, I was thinking, like, if I was the biggest Walker Kessler fan ever, I actually want to ask you guys this. If you were the biggest Walker Kessler fan ever and he developed, like, as well as he possibly could be, what type of player is he in this league? If, like, everything goes right.
Jared Allen.
Interesting. Okay.
I mean, it's like, because I consider Jared Allen to be like a really solid center. I mean, like he's a guy who rebounds well. He's high energy. I mean, Walker Kessler, I don't think he's going to be as athletic as Jared Allen is, and definitely not have as good hair. But I think somebody who plays a very similar role, where he knows exactly what he does. He rim runs, he blocks shots, he rebounds, he plays really tough defense. I think that's kind of the most ideal role for him. And if he can get to that point, then he can be a very valuable, like even starting caliber center if he gets to that. But just because, like, even his free throw shooting, like we mentioned earlier, has not been great, I don't ever see him as being a guy who's going to be like a consistent shooter in the league. And if you also look at even just his scoring last year, he wasn't a great scorer. He didn't have a lot of post moves. He doesn't have a lot of flexibility or creativity when he gets the ball down low. He kind of has to have a shot made, like created for him if he's going to score. So I think best case scenario is like a Jarrett Allen, where you're like, what, the 10th best center in the league. But I think that's like the absolute highest ceiling for him.
See, I don't see his ideal role end up being rim running because if you talked about his limited athleticism, I think. Actually, Landon, do you have one before I go into mine?
Go ahead.
I was thinking if everything went right for Walker Kessler, I think he turns into like the current version of like Brook Lopez, where you just ask him to shoot corner three until he's actually decent at it, because he's not athletic enough to be a vertical lob threat. So he's not going to be that great of a pick and roll partner, but can he be the guy, the center who protects the rim and then shoots corner threes? I think if he's going to be a starting caliber player, that's going to be the player model he needs to be, kind of like the Milwaukee version of Brook Lopez.
Yeah.
That would be amazing. I mean, he's never been a good shooter, so that would definitely be a transition.
Brook Lopez didn't shoot. when he
Yeah,
came out either. So
which I think is an interesting comparison that you brought up. But it took Brook Lopez 2 seasons to learn how to shoot. So if he got started working on it now with Jazz shooting coaches, then maybe during the 3rd and 4th year of his contract he could start to become that type of guy. But guys who go from being sub 60% free throw shooters to guys who can shoot corner threes, it's certainly possible because we've seen it before in the league. But it's definitely not a quick turnaround time. So I think we would be
I
waiting
said
to see
if
that.
everything goes right.
If everything goes right.
I didn't say that's what I think he was going to be. I was like, what is the possible? That's the only possible role. If everything goes right, because other than that, I don't think he's going to be a starting caliber center, because he's not enough of an athlete to be a vertical spacing lob threat rim runner. He's just not. So I was thinking elite rim protection, but not necessarily an elite athlete. Brook Lopez.
I think with that same description, I would go someone like Jakob Pertl. Might be a good comp. I think the defensive potential is there for Jakob. I don't know if he could even be as good of a scorer as Jakob Pertl is, but I think similar skill set, similar play type. I think he's someone can maybe throw the ball down too late in the shot clock, have him check up a shot. I don't love the idea of him shooting threes. Maybe he could develop it, but I could see him kind of definitely being paint guy, rim protector.
Yeah. So this is actually funny because Kyler, you brought up that question. I just brought up the Ringers draft guide because I wanted to see who they compared. It's if in their comparison guide, who is Walker Kessler most similar to, and the 2 guys they compared him to were Jakob Pertl and Jared Allen. So it's nice to know that Kevin O'Connor, I guess Landon and I just think very similarly to you. But out of all of those projections, if Walker Kessler could be a guy,
good.
Yeah,
Pertl's a good one. Jared Allen's just too far off, I think. But
yeah. So, but if he could become a guy who could shoot, because out of those 3 that we brought up, Brook Lopez is by far the most valuable shooter, and he's the one who's been the most valuable in the playoff team. So if Walker Kessler could develop a shot, which would take some time but could be awesome, that would be pretty amazing.
I wouldn't bet on it, but I think that's the only way he succeeds in the NBA.
All right. So Kyler, Landon, are you excited for any more Summer League stuff coming up? What are you most excited for between now and when we're going to talk again next week?
Well, should we talk a little bit about Belmar? I don't know. I know we don't have a lot of time, but Belmaro is also the other prospect.
All right, I will make this really, really quick because there's not much to go over. So the Jazz also, as part of the trade, got Leandro Bolmaro. He was drafted, I think, a year or 2 ago. He's a 6'6", 200 pound. Yeah, he's a 6'6", 200-pound point guard. He averages 1.4 points a game in 5.6 minutes for his career. He's the type of guy that was projected as potentially being a valuable player in the league because of his size and his ability to create, but it just hasn't translated well to an NBA setting. Is he going to be a guy who's going to play a lot of Jazz minutes? I would be shocked if he does because he hasn't shown it in 2 seasons. But who knows? He has the size. He has theoretically he has a playmaking ability. But when I was doing my research on him, last year he shot, I think it was 23% from 3. And it's really hard to play in this league when you're shooting 23% from 3 and you're a guard. So I think it was just kind of thrown in as part of the trade as maybe a sweetener on our end. We'll take Bolmaro's contract from you. But as a guy who's actually going to play, I think it's very unlikely.
He'll play for our Summer League team, so we'll get to see him a little bit, see if he's developed. But yeah, he's just a long shot really at this point. I did the same exercise where if everything goes right, what is he? And I like maybe a shorter version of Joe Ingles because he's not athletic, but he can pass. And so if he can develop a shot, he's feisty. So.
Yeah. I wonder if he'd be in the wrong position playing point guard or even a guard in general. I wonder if he'd do better if he was a 3.
If he bulks up and can play 6'6", 220, I think that's his best because he's just not athletic enough to be a guard. But he kind of plays with an aggressiveness that you can compare to Joe Ingles, I would say. So I think that's what you're hoping for. If you're Bolmaro's mom, you're hoping he turns into Joe Ingles.
That'd be incredible.
Well, we'll see what happens. Hopefully, out of all these guys we've talked about in this segment between Kessler, Bolmaro, Capulco, Jared Butler, we've talked a lot of these guys. the goal is that out of all of those 4 or 5 guys we talked about in this segment, if we could just have one of them hit and be part of an 8-man rotation in the future, that's a huge win. Like, none of these guys are expected to be incredible NBA players, with the possible exception of Jared Butler just because of his pedigree. But if we could at least get one of these guys who can play real minutes for the Jazz next year, then we're considering Summer League a success, even though as of right now, we're 0-3. We're still going to see what happens with Jazang, which should definitely be fun. And as always, we'll be here to bring you all of the Jazz news and different details as they're coming out. This has been another edition of the Upper Bowl Perspective. Thanks for hanging out with me, Kyler, and Landon, as always. If there's anything you want us to talk about, feel free to shoot us an email, upperbowlperspective@gmail.com, or some of our fans have already been doing, feel free to leave a comment on this video, and we will definitely be sure to address it in our next episode. Thanks, y'all, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Peace.
Bye.